300 years ago, the Polar wave rolled through human space like a held breath finally released. And by the time the Galactic Concord survey drones finished their sweep of Sol system, every reading they took agreed on the same impossible conclusion. No biosignatures, no active power grids, no orbital traffic, nothing but cold cities and colder colonies drifting in silent, radiation-scoured orbit. The Concord's Bureau of Vacant Assets stamped the file extinct in the particular shade of administrative red reserved for closed cases, archived 11,000 years of human recorded history into a single compressed data cube the size of a fingernail, and moved on to the considerably more interesting business of deciding who got to move in. That should have been the end of it. It very nearly was. For 300 years, the file sat untouched in the deepest, least visited archive of the Concord Bureau of Vacant Assets, a single closed case among tens of thousands, remarkable only for the mild administrative curiosity of a species that had, according to every scrap of recovered data, been building something resembling a genuine civilization right up until the moment it apparently stopped existing. Junior bureau clerks occasionally stumbled across the file during routine audits and remarked, briefly, on the strange completeness of the silence. No distress signals in the archive, no evidence of war, no obvious cause of collapse beyond the Polar wave's own well-documented, well-understood effects on comparable biospheres elsewhere in the Concord's long history of cataloging dead worlds. A few of the more thoughtful clerks noted, in margin annotations that nobody with real authority ever bothered reading, that human recovered data showed a species with an unusually stubborn survival instinct, one that seemed, on the scattered evidence available, entirely capable of digging in rather than simply expiring quietly. Those annotations were filed, archived, and forgotten, exactly like everything else about the case, because the Concord Bureau of Vacant Assets was not, as an institution, built to reward the asking of inconvenient questions about property. It had already decided how to divide. Instead, 300 years later, a Concord reclamation flotilla of 60 vessels, sleek, silver-hulled, humming with the smug confidence of an organization that had never once been asked to double-check its own paperwork, dropped out of warp at the edge of Sol's system to begin the formal process of resettling humanity's vacant worlds, and found, waiting for them in the exact center of their approach vector, a single black warship the size of a small moon. Running lights dark except for a slow, deliberate pulse of red along its spine, like something breathing. "Sensor error," said Flotilla Marshal Cessa Ilorinve, staring at her own tactical display with the flat, insulted disbelief of a woman who had built her entire career on the certainty that this system was empty. "Recalibrate. That signature cannot be reading as active." "Marshal, it's not a sensor error," her tactical officer said, voice climbing half an octave. "It's not just active, it's hailing us." The channel opened before anyone gave the order. "This is Sol Defense Authority vessel Extant, broadcasting to unidentified reclamation flotilla," said a voice that was calm in the particular, unhurried way of someone who had been waiting 300 years for exactly this conversation and had, somewhere along the way, stopped being angry about it and started finding it almost funny. "I understand there's some paperwork that says my species doesn't exist anymore. I'd like to file a complaint." In the war room buried 3 kilometers beneath the Colorado Rockies, rebuilt, reinforced, and quietly restaffed generation after generation across 300 years of a species, the rest of the galaxy had stopped watching. General Priya Adami Solberg stood with her arms folded, watching the same feed the Concord flotilla was watching, and allowed herself, for the first time in a very long shift, something close to a smile. "There she is," Adami Solberg murmured, "right on schedule." Behind her, a junior watch officer barely out of the academy stared at the display with an expression somewhere between awe and disbelief. "Ma'am, is the Extant actually engaging alone? 60 ships, and we're sending one. Lieutenant, Ademi Sahlberg said, not unkindly, we've had 300 years to build exactly one thing that mattered, and I promise you, we didn't spend 3 centuries building a ship that needs backup. She nodded toward the display, toward the black shape sitting motionless at the heart of the Concord formation, its slow red pulse steady as a heartbeat. Watch. This is the part they don't teach you in the histories, because until about 4 minutes ago, nobody outside this bunker knew it was true. Humanity never went extinct, we just stopped. RSVPing to the galaxy's parties. Today, we're crashing this one. The lieutenant, whose name was Dario Fenimore, and who had, in point of fact, been briefed on the existence of the Extant program exactly 40 minutes earlier, as part of an emergency clearance escalation that had left him more rattled than the 60-ship flotilla currently on his display, swallowed hard. Ma'am, with respect, how long has this project actually been running? The briefing I got was pretty thin on specifics. Longer than you or I have been alive, Lieutenant, Ademi Sahlberg said. My grandmother worked on the original Shield Harmonics team when she was younger than you are now. She never saw it finished. Her daughter didn't either. I'm the first generation in my family that gets to watch it actually earn its keep, and frankly, I intend to enjoy every second of it. She gestured at the display, where the second barrage had just dissolved harmlessly against the Extant shielding. 300 years of nobody outside this room believing we were ready for anything. Watch what ready actually looks like. Fenimore didn't answer. He didn't need to. The number on the corner of the display, 60 hostile vessels, 0 effective damage, was doing all the talking anyone in that room required. Aboard the Extant, Captain Idris Okonkwo Faraday sat in a command chair built for a war that had, until this exact moment, existed only in 3 centuries of quiet, patient rehearsal, and watched 60 conquered vessels scramble to reconcile a filed extinction report with the very much alive, very much armed contradiction currently sitting in the middle of their formation. Marshal, this cannot be a legitimate contact, Ylor Invey's own tactical officer was saying, loud enough that the Extant's comm array picked it up cleanly across the open channel. The extinction filing was verified by 3 independent survey passes. There is no protocol for this. Then perhaps, Okonkwo Faraday said, cutting smoothly into the conversation he wasn't technically supposed to be part of yet, you should have run a 4th survey pass before you started subdividing my species' home system into parcel lots. I've seen the listings, by the way. Lovely photography. Very misleading description of the neighborhood. Flotilla Marshal Ylor Invey's composure, already fraying, snapped fully into something colder and more defensive. Identify yourself and your authority to speak for a species officially classified extinct by Concord Bureau Ruling 7721 Delta. This classification carries full legal weight across 211 member worlds. You have no standing to contest it, and this vessel, regardless of its impressive sensor profile, has no legal basis to obstruct a lawfully authorized reclamation. Captain Idris Okonkwo Faraday, Sol Defense Authority, and I'll be honest with you, Marshal, I don't actually care what standing your bureau thinks I have, Okonkwo Faraday said, leaning back in his chair with the easy, unbothered posture of a man who had rehearsed this exact confrontation more times than he could count, and had long since stopped finding it stressful. See, the thing about declaring a species extinct is that it's supposed to be a description of reality, not a legal instrument you get to enforce against reality once reality stops cooperating. I'm not obstructing a lawful reclamation. I'm informing you that the premise underneath your entire legal framework just walked into the room and asked for a formal correction to the record. This is absurd, Ylor Invey snapped. 1 vessel. You expect 60 ships of the Concord Reclamation Flotilla to simply reverse 3 centuries of settled law because a single warship appeared and started making speeches. No, Okonkwo Faraday said. I expect 60 ships of the Concord Reclamation Flotilla to leave, because in about the next 90 seconds, you're going to open fire on me, and then I'm going to spend the following 20 minutes demonstrating, in extremely practical terms, exactly how settled that law actually is. After that, I think the reversal takes care of itself." He paused, glancing sideways at his weapons officer with the faintest ghost of a smile. "Lieutenant Vasquez Acoro, how's our paperwork looking?" "Filed and time-stamped, sir," she said, deadpan. "Formal complaint against Extinction Classification 7721 Delta, submitted directly to Bureau, records the moment we dropped out of warp. Receipt confirmed." "Outstanding," Okonkwo Faraday said. "Nothing like doing things through proper channels." "You find this amusing," Ilorin Vey said, and there was, underneath the accusation, something almost like disbelief that anyone could approach a moment this fraught with anything resembling levity. 60 ships stand ready to enforce a lawful reclamation, and you make jokes about paperwork receipts. "I find it a little amusing, yeah," Okonkwo Fa Rayday admitted. "Not because I don't take this seriously, Marshal. I promise you, I take it about as seriously as anything I've ever done. But my grandmother used to say that the surest sign a species has actually healed from something terrible is that it can still find something funny on the worst day of someone else's plans. We spent 3 centuries being very, very serious about survival. I think we've earned the right to enjoy the day that seriousness finally pays off." He tilted his head slightly, watching her tactical readout scroll past on a secondary display he wasn't technically supposed to have access to, and didn't mention that he did. "Besides, Marshal, I really did file that complaint. Somebody in your bureau's going to open their morning correspondence to find a formal notarized objection from a species they filed as extinct. I think that deserves to be a little funny, even to you." Ilorin Vey's mandible-less face, smooth, pale, built for an aquatic species long since adapted to zero-gravity command decks, twitched with something that in a human would have been a scowl. "You are attempting to unsettle me with humor. It will not work. 60 ships, Captain. I do not know what that single vessel is capable of, but I know what 60 ships are capable of, and I intend to demonstrate it. Bring the flotilla to full readiness. Total salvo on my mark." "There it is," Okonkwo Faraday murmured, entirely unsurprised, and settled deeper into his chair the way a man settles in for a show he already knows the ending to. "All right, everyone. Let's give the Marshal her demonstration." 60 Concord vessels, sleek, fast, individually far more advanced than anything humanity had fielded 3 centuries earlier, built by a civilization that had spent those same 3 centuries assuming it had no competition left worth preparing for, opened fire in a single, coordinated barrage. A storm of graviton lances and phased plasma bolts and long-range disruptor fire that turned the space around the Extant into a churning wall of violent light. It hit a shell of deep crimson energy that flexed outward from the ship's hull like a struck drum and simply held. Not a flicker, not a dip in output. The entire barrage simply arrived, registered against that shimmering red boundary, and dissipated into harmless, drifting sparks. "Report," Ilorin Vey said, voice tight. "Marshal, 0 damage. Shield integrity on the target reads at 100%. I don't understand how a single vessel is absorbing 60 ships' combined output without so much as a power fluctuation." "Recalibrate and fire again," Ilorin Vey said, though something in her voice had already started to crack. "You could do that," Okonkwo Faraday said pleasantly, still on the open channel. "And I'll be honest, I don't mind. It's a good workout for our Shield Harmonics team. They like the data. But I want to explain something to you first, Marshal, because I think you deserve context before this gets any more embarrassing for your bureau. When the Pallor wave hit 300 years ago, it didn't kill us. It nearly did. I won't pretend otherwise. We lost more people in 18 months than in all our wars combined. But it didn't finish the job, and once we understood that we'd survived something that should have ended us, we made a decision as a species. We decided the rest of the galaxy never got to see us again until we were absolutely certain nothing could do that to us twice. So we went quiet. We rebuilt in the dark. We watched your Concord catalog our home system as vacant real estate for 300 years, and every single year, we got a little more ready for the day somebody actually showed up to collect. You are describing 3 centuries of premeditated deception, Ilorin Vey said, aghast. I'm describing 3 centuries of a species that got knocked down hard enough to nearly disappear, and decided the only acceptable response was to make sure it never happened again, Okonkwo Faraday said, and for the first time an edge crept into his voice, quiet and hard beneath the calm. You want to call that deception? That's your prerogative, Marshal. I call it not making the same mistake twice. And what precisely did 3 centuries of preparation cost your species? Ilorin Vey asked, and for a moment the question sounded less like an accusation and more like genuine, unsettled curiosity, the sound of someone trying to understand an opponent she had badly misjudged. A civilization does not simply vanish from every survey and reappear 300 years later with a vessel capable of shrugging off a full flotilla salvo. What did you give up to build this? Okonkwo Faraday considered the question longer than he'd considered anything else in the exchange so far. Contact mostly, he said finally. Trade, diplomacy, every convenience that comes with letting the rest of the galaxy know you're still here and still growing. We gave up. 300 years of being part of the wider conversation, Marshal, because the alternative was risking that the next civilization to find us weren't half as patient as your bureau turned out to be with its paperwork. Some of my ancestors argued we were being paranoid. Some argued we weren't being paranoid enough. In the end, the ones who won that argument were the ones who pointed out that paranoia only costs you time, and being wrong about a threat like the Pallor wave costs you everything. We had time. We didn't have anything else to spare. A grim philosophy to build a civilization around, Ilorin Vey said. Maybe, Okonkwo Faraday allowed. Ask me again in a few minutes whether it worked. Fire again, Ilorin Vey snapped to her own bridge, ignoring him now. Full spread, independent targeting every ship. I want that shield cracked. The second barrage came in wider, more chaotic, 60 ships firing independently rather than in coordinated volley, hoping that scattered, unpredictable fire might find some seam in the Extant's defenses that concentrated fire hadn't. It hit the same crimson shell and vanished just as completely, the only visible effect a faint ripple spreading outward across the barrier's surface like rain on still water. Second salvo, zero effect, Vasquez Acoro reported from the Extant's weapons station, and there was, buried under her professional calm, something close to satisfaction. Captain, we've got a clean firing solution across the entire flotilla. Your call on sequencing. Same protocol as always, Okonkwo Faraday said. Nothing lethal. Disable weapons, shields, and propulsion, in that order, ship by ship. Fastest response times first so nobody gets a clean second shot at us. I want this on record as a demonstration, not a massacre. 300 years of quiet buildup doesn't need an ugly ending tacked onto it now. He tapped the armrest console, opening a wider channel that would carry not just to the Concord flotilla, but via a relay he'd set up the moment they dropped out of warp, directly back to Concord Bureau headquarters itself, several dozen light-years away, with only the usual transmission lag to slow it down. Marshal Ilorin Vey, I'm going to give you the same courtesy I plan to give every commander in your flotilla today. Stand your ships down, and nobody gets hurt. I'd genuinely rather end this with a correction to your records than a body count. Refuse, and I'll simply take the choice out of your hands, one ship at a time, until you run out of ships willing to keep making it for you. You expect the flotilla marshal of a conquered reclamation force to surrender to a single vessel on the basis of a shield we do not understand. Ilorin Vey's voice had climbed toward something raw now, disbelief curdling fast into fury. I have 60 ships. You are one. You keep saying that number like it's supposed to change something, Okonkwo Faraday said, almost gently. I promise you, Marshal, I've had 300 years to get comfortable with what one ship, built properly, can do to 60 ships built on the assumption nobody's watching. Let's find out together. Helm, take us in." The Extant moved, and it moved with a grace that made every sensor operator across the Concord flotilla momentarily forget their own training, because nothing that size had any business turning that fast, accelerating that cleanly, threading between capital ship hulls with margins that should have been mathematically impossible for a vessel of its mass. It closed on the nearest cluster of Concord ships, a 5-vessel escort wing designated, according to the flotilla's own broadcast registry, the Vey family holding security detachment, privately contracted muscle riding along to protect whichever Concord official had bid highest on Earth's real estate, and opened fire with the same eerie, patient precision that had, 300 years earlier and half a galaxy away, in a different engagement humanity still told stories about, become something close to a signature. 5 beams of deep crimson energy lanced out, each one finding its target's shield harmonic within a fraction of a second and unraveling it, then retargeting toward weapons and engines with tight, controlled bursts that left hulls intact and crews alive but ships thoroughly, undeniably finished as combatants. Vey family holding security detachment disabled, Vasquez-Acaro reported. All 5 vessels, 0 casualties, 0 hull breaches below decking level 4. "There's the answer to your question, Marshal," Okonkwo Faraday said. 55 to go. On the private security detachment's lead vessel, its commander, a hired gun named Tarek Fenn, whose contract had made no provision whatsoever for engaging something that could shrug off 60 ships without a flicker, could be heard on an open emergency channel abandoning the fight entirely. This contract did not cover engagement with an unidentified superweapon. "I am in vo. King Clause 14. We are disengaging. Vey family holdings can find someone else to die for their real estate portfolio." "Smart man," Okonkwo Faraday murmured, echoing, without quite meaning to, words that would have felt familiar to anyone who'd heard the stories about a different human captain in a different system 3 centuries earlier. "Let him go. Anyone who disengages honestly gets a clean exit. We're not here to punish good instincts." Not every commander in the flotilla shared Fenn's appreciation for arithmetic, however. On the trailing edge of the formation, 3 Concord light cruisers, fast, agile vessels designated the Bureau's Vanguard Squadron, crewed by officers young enough to still believe their academy training had prepared them for something like this, broke independently from the collapsing formation and attempted a high-speed strafing run along the Extant's dorsal hull, evidently gambling that raw velocity might succeed where sustained fire had already failed twice. "Captain, 3 bogies inbound on a strafing vector, dorsal approach," Vasquez-Acaro reported. "They're moving fast, reading nearly triple the velocity of anything else in the flotilla. Might be some kind of experimental drive system." "Let them come," Okonkwo Faraday said, entirely unbothered, watching the 3 ships scream toward his own hull with the mild, professional interest of a man watching weather roll in from a safe distance. Fast doesn't help much if the shield doesn't care how quickly you arrive. The Vanguard Squadron tore across the Extant's dorsal shielding at a speed that would have shredded any conventional armor plating of the era, weapons discharging in a continuous, overlapping stream meant to overwhelm any localized shield harmonics through sheer rate of fire rather than raw output, and found, to the audible dismay of their own young squadron leader, that the crimson shell simply absorbed the entire pass without so much as a visible ripple. "This is not possible," the squadron leader could be heard saying on an open channel, voice cracking with something between disbelief and genuine fear. "Command, the target's shielding isn't scaling with impact frequency the way our simulations predicted. It's not degrading at all, it's just, sir, it's not doing anything." "Because it doesn't need to," Okonkwo Faraday said, cutting gently into the channel. I appreciate the creativity, though genuinely that's a clever idea, trying to beat a shield through sheer rate of fire instead of raw output. Wrong shield to try it on, but clever. He nodded toward Vasquez Acoro. Same as always. Weapons and engines, nothing lethal. 3 beams lanced out in near-perfect unison, catching the Vanguard squadron mid-pass and stripping their shields before they could complete their run, then disabling weapons and propulsion in tight, controlled bursts that left all 3 light cruisers drifting, dark and humbled, in the Extant's wake. Vanguard squadron disabled, Vasquez Acoro reported. That's 8 down total, Captain, and we still haven't lost a single percentage point of shield capacity worth mentioning. Copy that, Okonkwo Faraday said, and then, back on the open fleet channel, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't quite been there a few minutes earlier. Marshal, I want to point something out because I think it matters. Every ship that's broken off and tried something clever on its own has ended up disabled a little faster than the ones that waited for your orders. I'd genuinely rather you called the whole thing off before I run out of squadrons willing to be creative with me. But Flotilla Marshal Ilorinve watched the same display with a very different reaction, not quite fear, not quite fury, but the particular vertigo of watching an Assumption 3 centuries deep collapse in real time. All remaining vessels, she snapped, concentrate fire. I want that ship's shields cracked through sheer accumulated output if precision will not work. Converge. Across the shattered remains of her formation, 55 conquered ships began the slow, ponderous work of reorganizing into a single convergence geometry. Capital ships peeling away from their scattered defensive postures and threading into a tight, overlapping lattice designed to focus every remaining weapon battery in the flotilla onto a single point in space. It was, by any conventional measure, an impressive piece of coordinated fleet maneuvering. Dozens of vessels of wildly different classes and drive signatures, from lumbering troop and processing transports repurposed as makeshift gun platforms to the flotilla's fastest remaining escorts, all converging along carefully calculated vectors meant to avoid overlapping their own fields of fire, while still delivering every erg of output onto the same coordinates within the same half-second window. That's a textbook Concord fleet convergence maneuver, Captain, Vasquez Acoro noted, tracking the reorganization with something between professional respect and clinical detachment. I'll give them this much. Their formation discipline's genuinely impressive. If we were facing a conventional target, that geometry would put out enough sustained output to crack a planetary shield array in under 10 seconds. Good thing we're not a conventional target, Okonkwo Faraday said, watching the lattice tighten around them with the calm, unhurried interest of a man watching a storm system form on a distant horizon, aware of its power but entirely unthreatened by it. Let them finish setting up. There's no sense interrupting good technique. Best they get the full demonstration of what it doesn't accomplish. 55 remaining conquered ships pulled into a tight convergence formation, capacitor banks screaming toward maximum output, and unleashed a barrage that dwarfed even the opening salvo. A single overwhelming pulse of concentrated destructive force, aimed at collapsing the Extant's shields through raw accumulated weight rather than any hope of finesse. From outside the engagement, the discharge would have been visible from the system's outer planets. A single, blinding column of combined energy output bright enough to cast fresh shadows across the icy rings of the system's gas giants, briefly rivaling the light of Sol itself before collapsing back into darkness. It hit, and this time the crimson shell flexed hard enough to be visible from every ship in the formation, rippling outward in concentric waves of light that briefly outshone the distant sun itself. On the Extant's bridge, consoles flickered, alarms chirped a brief warning, and then steadied back to green. Shield integrity, Okonkwo Faraday asked, voice level even as the aftershock of the impact still hummed faintly through the deck plating. Down to 91%, sir, Vasquez Acoro reported, genuine surprise coloring her voice. First real dent all fight. feedback cascades rattling their own formation too. I'm reading system faults across at least 4 vessels along the convergence perimeter from their own overlapping discharge. Sure enough, across the Concord formation, the telltale signs of that feedback were already visible, secondary explosions rippling harmlessly along the hull plating of ships positioned too close to their neighbors' discharge vectors. Emergency klaxons audible even through the compressed static of open comm channels. Officers on no fewer than 6 separate bridges shouting contradictory damage control orders into a chaos their own convergence tactic had created entirely without the Extant's help. "Sir," came a new voice cutting into the general channel, tight with barely restrained panic. A Concord engineering officer, evidently patched into the fleet-wide broadcast by mistake in the confusion. "Marshal, we cannot sustain a second convergence discharge at that output level. Our own capacitor banks are bleeding thermal load across 3 adjacent hulls. If we fire again at full output, we risk a cascading failure across the entire lattice." "Then don't fire again at full output," Ilorinve snapped back, though even as she said it, the raw fury in her voice had begun to fray at the edges into something closer to desperation. "Reduce output, tighten the geometry, try again." "There it is," Okonkwo said, and something in his posture shifted, the easy banter giving way briefly to focused seriousness. "All right, they want to bring it. Let's finish this properly. Helm, take us into the heart of the formation, close enough that their own ships can't get clean angles on each other without repeating that feedback problem. Weapons, priority targeting on shield generators and weapon batteries, fastest responders first." "Aye, Captain." The Extant surged forward, and surged was, finally, the correct word. The ship that had spent the engagement so far moving with patient, almost contemptuous ease now tore through the heart of the Concord formation, with an acceleration curve that no sensor operator on any of the 55 remaining ships could reconcile with a hull that size, weaving between capital ship-scale vessels with margins that made grown officers on more than one bridge audibly gasp. "Concord frontline vessel Bureau's mandate disabled," Vasquez-Acoro called out, tracking the engagement with crisp, practiced efficiency. "Escort wing designation Silver Reach, 3 vessels disabled. Reclamation transport second homestead, sir. That one's unarmed, flagging it. No engagement." "Good catch," Okonkwo said, banking the ship hard around the unarmed transport's hull, giving it a wide, deliberate berth even as 2 more armed escorts scrambled to intercept from opposite angles in a pincer maneuver that mirrored, almost exactly, a tactic humanity's own histories recorded from 3 centuries earlier, and an entirely different fleet. The captain of the Bureau's mandate, a career administrator-turned-fleet officer named Fleet Director Hessa Corvin, who had spent considerably more of her service record in budget hearings than in actual combat, could be heard on an open emergency channel attempting, with visibly deteriorating composure, to salvage something from the engagement. "Auxiliary power to point defense grid. Someone find me a firing solution on anything. I don't care what. We cannot simply sit here disabled while the Marshal." "Director Corvin," Okonkwo said, cutting in, his tone gentler than the interruption might have suggested. "Your weapons are offline, your shields are offline, and your point defense grid isn't going to do anything useful against a targeting system that already knows exactly where every component on your hull is located. Stand your crew down. You put up a reasonable defense for someone whose service record says she spent more time reviewing supply contracts than commanding a warship, and there's no shame left in this fight worth chasing." There was a pause and then quieter, almost embarrassed. "Standing down. Damage control, report to auxiliary systems all decks." "Priya, sorry, wrong Priya, force of habit Vasquez-Acoro. Split the batteries, dorsal and ventral. Simultaneous discharge on both pincer vessels." "Aye, Captain, firing." 2 beams lanced out in the same instant, catching both flanking vessels across their shield harmonics before either could complete its approach, and within seconds both had joined the growing tally of disabled hulls drifting, dark and humbled, in the widening debris field of the Concord's confidence. "That's 21 down, Captain," Vasquez Acoro reported. "Formation's fracturing hard. I'm reading a dozen ships attempting independent withdrawal without waiting on the Marshal's authorization." "Let them go if they're genuinely disengaging," Okonkwo Faraday said. "Same rule as always, we don't fire on retreat." Not all of the flotilla's remaining resistance came from ships willing to fight fair, however. A pair of Concord heavy cruisers designated the assessor's judgment and the Bureau's reckoning. Sister vessels crewed by officers with considerably more conviction in the Concord's manifest authority than Director Corvin had ever managed, attempted a coordinated ambush from the flotilla's blind spot relative to the Extant's current heading, cutting their own engines and drifting silently on momentum alone in an effort to close undetected before opening fire at point-blank range. "Captain, picking up 2 contacts on a ballistic drift vector, engines cold. They're trying to sneak up on us," Vasquez Acoro said, a note of genuine appreciation creeping into her voice despite herself. "That's actually a solid tactic against a conventional sensor suite." "It is," Okonkwo Faraday agreed. "Good thing ours isn't conventional. Let them get close enough to feel clever about it, then take them down before they fire. No sense letting them waste the ambush and the shot both." The 2 heavy cruisers drifted to within point-blank range, engines flaring back to life in the same instant, their weapons batteries powered up for what their commanders clearly believed would be a devastating, undetected alpha strike, only to find their own shield harmonics unraveling a full second before either ship managed to complete a single discharge, weapons and propulsion going dark in the same practiced, surgical pattern that had already claimed 21 of their flotilla mates. "Assessor's judgment and Bureau's reckoning disabled," Vasquez Acoro reported, and there was, unmistakably now, something close to genuine enjoyment in her voice. 23 down, Captain. I don't think anyone in that flotilla believes in the element of surprise anymore." "Can't say I blame them," Okonkwo Faraday said, guiding the Extant deeper into the heart of the collapsing formation. The last organized resistance the flotilla managed to muster came not from a warship at all, but from an aging Concord logistics cruiser named the Ninth Assessment, whose captain, a stubborn veteran named Fleet Officer Barrow Kess, who had spent 40 years hauling requisitioned cargo rather than fighting battles, and had apparently decided this was not the day to start being reasonable about it, ordered his unarmed vessel directly into the Extant's projected flight path in a desperate, almost suicidal attempt to force a collision that might, at the very least, slow the human ship down long enough for the rest of the flotilla to regroup. "Captain, I'm reading an unarmed logistics vessel on a direct collision intercept," Vasquez Acoro said, alarm sharpening her voice for the first time all engagement. "They don't have weapons, sir. This isn't an attack. It's a ramming attempt." "Helm evasive now," Okonkwo Faraday said, all trace of his earlier ease vanishing instantly. "I don't care how good our shields are. I'm not running a civilian logistics crew into our hull just to prove a point we've already made 40 times over." The Extant banked hard, a maneuver that should have been physically impossible for a vessel of its mass to execute at that velocity without tearing itself apart, and slid past the Ninth Assessment's collision course with a margin so narrow that for one suspended half-second, every officer on both bridges held their breath in unison. The logistics cruiser sailed harmlessly past into open space, its momentum carrying it well clear of the engagement entirely, its captain's voice crackling onto an open channel a moment later, ragged with adrenaline and something that sounded uncomfortably close to shame. "That was," Kess started, then stopped, seeming to genuinely struggle for the words. "That was a foolish order. I apologize, Captain. 40 years of service, and I have never once given an order I regretted issuing before the words finished leaving my mouth. This one I regretted before I finished speaking it." You care about your flotilla, fleet officer, Okonkwo Faraday said, and there was no mockery in it at all, only a tired, genuine understanding. That's not foolish. It's just aimed at the wrong target today. Power down, get your crew somewhere safe, and go home. Nobody on my ship is angry with you. Thank you, Captain, Kess said, quieter now, for not running us down when you clearly could have. We don't run down unarmed ships, Okonkwo Faraday said simply. Not today, not ever. That's not the kind of species we decided to be. He glanced toward the sensor display, toward the wide, distinctive hull of a second unarmed vessel trailing behind the main formation, its registry data scrolling up on his own console a moment later. Vasquez Akoro, what am I looking at on that second transport? She was quiet for a beat too long before answering, and when she did, her voice had lost its easy professionalism entirely. Settlement processing vessel, sir, designed for large-scale population relocation and containment pending resettlement authorization. Manifest data suggests it was carrying prefabricated habitat modules for the incoming Concord colonists. It was going to house the reclamation administrators, while they oversaw redistribution of what they still believed was vacant human territory. Okonkwo Faraday's jaw tightened just slightly, the only outward sign of something colder moving beneath his calm. So they weren't just filing paperwork on an empty system. They were already moving in the furniture. He was quiet a moment, and then, on the open channel, his voice carried none of the earlier banter at all. Marshal Ilorinve, I just had my crew confirm your flotilla was hauling settlement infrastructure for a system your own bureau hadn't finished stripping the bodies out of, as far as your paperwork was concerned. I want you to understand that changes how generous I'm planning to be for the rest of this conversation. I was going to let this end quietly. I'm still going to let it end quietly, because that's who we decided to be 300 years ago, and I'm not throwing that away over you, but quiet and forgiving aren't the same thing. And I promise you, Marshal, the Bureau is going to hear about every detail of what that ship was for. There was no response for several seconds, only the low static hum of open comms and, faintly beneath it, the sound of a bridge with nothing useful left to say. 28 disabled, Captain, Vasquez Akoro reported quietly into that silence. Marshall's flagship and 11 escorts remain combat effective. Everyone else is either dark or actively withdrawing. Copy, Okonkwo Faraday said, and turned his attention finally and fully back to Ilorinve's own vessel, a command cruiser twice the size of anything else remaining in her shattered formation, its own weapons still hot, still tracking, in what both of them understood by now was a purely symbolic defiance. Marshal, 28 of your 60 ships disabled, a dozen more in active withdrawal. That leaves you 11 escorts and a flagship, against one vessel that hasn't lost a single percentage point of shield integrity worth worrying about in the last several minutes. I think we both know how the rest of this goes if you keep pushing it. You have not won anything, Ilorinve said, though the words came out ragged now, stripped of their earlier certainty. You have humiliated one flotilla at the edge of one system the Concord had already written off as worthless beyond its real estate value. This changes nothing about the scale of the Concord itself. We are 211 member worlds. You are one system, recently returned from an extinction filing that half the Bureau will simply argue was a clerical anomaly rather than acknowledge as a genuine failure of process. Maybe, Okonkwo Faraday allowed. I'm not actually here to conquer your Concord, Marshal, in case that wasn't clear from the last 20 minutes. I don't want your worlds. I don't want a seat on your boo. Ro, I want exactly one thing, and it's a small thing all considered. I want the record corrected. I want it entered formally, permanently, into whatever registry your Concord keeps its settled truths in, that humanity is not extinct, was never property to be reclaimed, and is not, under any circumstances, available for resettlement by anyone who didn't bother checking first. That's the whole ask. Everything else, every ship, every crew, every reclamation contract your bureau signed on the assumption of an empty system. That's yours to sort out on your own time. I've got exactly one job today, and I intend to finish it in the next couple of minutes." Ailorin Vey was silent for a long moment, staring at a tactical display that told her, in numbers she could no longer argue with, precisely how thoroughly the last 20 minutes had rewritten everything she'd believed walking into this system. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the last of its performative authority, replaced by something wearier, more honest. "And if I refuse to transmit the correction, then I hold your flagship here while the rest of your flotilla limps home and tells the story anyway," Okonkwo Faraday said. "Same outcome, messier delivery. I'd rather you did it yourself, Marshal, while there's still a version of this where you get to be the officer who corrected the record instead of the one who got dragged into correcting it. That's not a threat. That's just me trying to leave you a little dignity on the way out, because you fought this about as well as anyone could have, given that nobody told you what you were actually up against until it was already too late to matter. You could have destroyed my entire flotilla," Ailorin Vey said, quieter now, almost a genuine question rather than a challenge. "From the first salvo onward, I understood that total annihilation was well within your capability. Why show restraint to a force that arrived here to settle over the graves of a species you allowed us to believe were exactly that, graves?" Okonkwo Faraday was quiet for a moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice carried none of the earlier banter at all. "Because the last time my species nearly disappeared, Marshal, nobody chose that for us. The Pallor wave didn't ask permission and it didn't leave room for restraint on either side. We didn't get to decide how that story went. This one, I get to decide. And I decided a long time ago, long before I ever sat in this chair, that if the day ever came when we finally had the power to answer force with overwhelming force, we'd choose not to, every single time it was possible to choose otherwise. Not because your flotilla didn't deserve consequences. Because a species that survives near extinction by building something this dangerous, and then uses it exactly the way the thing that almost killed us would have used it, hasn't actually learned anything from what happened. It's just found a new way to be the danger instead of the victim. I'd rather be neither if I can help it. That is a remarkably specific kind of restraint to codify into a warship's operating doctrine," Ailorin Vey said, something almost like genuine curiosity threading through the exhaustion in her voice. "It took 3 centuries of arguing about it to get the doctrine right," Okonkwo Faraday said. "Turns out that's about how long it takes a species to agree on anything, even the important ones. Especially the important ones." There was a long pause, filled with the particular silence of someone doing very unpleasant, very necessary math, and then quietly, transmitting the correction now. Full acknowledgement of erroneous extinction classification, effective immediately, backdated to original filing. A beat. "For what little it is worth, Captain, I do not believe my superiors will thank me for this." "No," Okonkwo Faraday agreed. "I don't imagine they will. For what it's worth, right back at you, Marshal, you kept your composure a lot longer than most people would have, watching 60 ships fail to so much as scratch a hull they didn't understand. That's not nothing." He glanced at his own display, watching the last flickers of resistance across the Concord formation finally, fully still. "Vasquez Okoro, final tally, if you do the honors." 60 hostile vessels engaged, she reported, and there was, unmistakably now, real satisfaction bleeding through her professional calm. 28 disabled through direct engagement, 19 in confirmed voluntary withdrawal, 12 remaining combat effective, including the flagship now standing down per Marshal's order, 1 unarmed transport, 1 settlement processing vessel, 1 logistics cruiser, all unengaged. Total human casualties, 0. Total confirmed enemy casualties, 0. Engagement time from first contact to flagship stand-down, 19 minutes, 11 seconds. 19 minutes, Okonkwo Faraday repeated, allowing himself finally a real smile. A little slower than I promised myself in training, but I'll take it. He glanced around his own bridge. At 60 officers who had spent the last 19 minutes executing a plan, 3 centuries in the making with the calm, practiced precision of people who had run this scenario in simulation more times than any of them cared to count, and found, for just a moment, that he didn't have anything clever left to say about it. Only a quiet, private pride that had nowhere obvious to go except into the log entry he was about to file. For the record, he added, more to himself than to anyone else on the bridge, I want it noted that every single person on this crew trained for a fight none of us ever actually wanted to have. I'm glad we didn't have to want it. I'm gladder still that when the day came, we didn't need to. He opened the relay channel one final time, routing it back through the layered comm buoys toward the war room 3 kilometers beneath the Colorado Rockies, where General Adami Sahlberg had watched every second of the engagement unfold on a display that, for the first time in 300 years, showed the rest of the galaxy exactly what quiet patience had bought humanity in the dark. Command, this is Extant. Flotilla engagement concluded. 60 hostiles neutralized, withdrawn, or surrendered. 0 casualties, both sides. Extinction classification correction transmitted and confirmed by Flotilla Marshal directly. Recommend full diplomatic follow-up once Bureau finishes explaining itself to 211 very confused member worlds. In the war room, the silence that had gripped every officer for the better part of 20 minutes broke all at once into something between disbelieving laughter and outright celebration, the kind that had been 3 centuries in the waiting and arrived, finally, all in a rush. Adami Sahlberg let out a long breath, feeling the tension of 300 years of quiet, patient rebuilding finally, fully released, and allowed herself, at last, a genuine smile. "Lieutenant," she said to the junior officer still staring, wide-eyed at the display, "I believe that answers your question about backup." The withdrawal took the better part of 2 hours, and Okonkwo Faraday watched every last vessel of it personally, standing near the Extant's forward viewport with his arms crossed as disabled ships restored auxiliary power and limped, one by one, toward warp spool-up, escorted at a respectful distance by a vessel that had, less than half a day earlier, dismantled an entire flotilla's confidence without spilling a single drop of blood on either side. The Vey family holdings escorts went first, followed by the 19 ships that had withdrawn honestly, several of their commanders transmitting brief, almost apologetic acknowledgments as they went. Director Corvin's bureau's mandate went next in the queue, and before her ship folded into warp, she opened one final private channel to the Extant, her voice carrying none of the panic from earlier, only a kind of tired, professional curiosity. "Captain, for the record, and I promise this isn't an official bureau inquiry, just my own, what happens now? Not to the paperwork. To your people. 300 years of hiding, and now the whole galaxy knows you're here. That's not a small thing to absorb, on either side." Okonkwo Faraday considered the question with the same seriousness he'd given every other one that day. "Honestly, Director, I think that's above my pay grade to answer. I'm a captain, not a diplomat. But if you're asking what I hope happens, I hope we get to be boring for a while. I hope the next ship that comes through this system is a trade delegation instead of a reclamation flotilla, and I hope the conversation is about tariffs and cultural exchange programs instead of extinction filings. 3 centuries of being ready for the worst case is exhausting, Director. I'd like a turn at the version of contact that doesn't require anybody's shields to be tested first." "A fair hope," Corvin said. "For what it's worth, I intend to submit a full account of today's engagement to the Bureau's diplomatic division rather than the military one. I think that's the more useful place for this story to land." "I appreciate that," Okonkwo Faraday said, and meant it, recognizing in the offer the first small, genuine gesture of the entire engagement that had cost the person making it something real to give. "Safe travels home, Director." One of Director Corvin's junior officers patched briefly onto the same private channel before it closed, offered a small, almost involuntary addition before the connection cut. For what it's worth, Captain, my grandfather used to tell stories about a species that supposedly vanished overnight, back when he was young. I never believed they were more than campfire tales meant to scare cadets into taking survey work seriously. I'm glad to have been wrong. Most good stories turn out to have more truth in them than anyone expects, Okonkwo Faraday said. Glad we could clear that one up properly. Marshal Ilorinve's flagship was the last to leave the system entirely, her final transmission arriving not as a threat but as something closer to a grudging, professional respect exchanged between commanders who had, however lopsidedly, tested each other properly. This will not be quickly forgotten within the Concord, Captain. Some among the Bureau will call it a clerical embarrassment best buried. Others will call for a proper diplomatic delegation, given what today has demonstrated. I do not know which view will prevail. I know only that I will not personally argue for silence, because I have seen, now, precisely what a species does after 300 years of being underestimated. That's really all I was hoping to demonstrate, Marshal, Okonkwo Faraday said. Go home, file the correction. Let the rest of your bureau sort itself out from there. One more question, Captain, if you will permit it, Ilorinve said, and there was something almost hesitant in her voice now, the particular hesitation of a professional asking something outside the scope of her professional duties. You spoke earlier of 3 centuries spent preparing alone in silence for a day you could not be certain would ever come. Was it worth it? Not in terms of the outcome today. That answer, I think, is now self-evident to everyone watching. I mean for you. For the generations who built this ship and never lived to see it used. Okonkwo Faraday was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice had softened into something more private than anything he'd said over the open channel all day. I think about that a lot, actually. My great-grandmother worked on the earliest shield theory when she was younger than my own daughter is now. She spent 40 years on this project and never saw so much as a prototype fly. I used to wonder if that felt like wasted time to her, working on something she'd never get to see finished. He glanced briefly at a small data plaque mounted near his own console, a name etched into dark metal, one of several such plaques scattered quietly around the Extant's bridge, each honoring an engineer or officer or theorist who'd given decades to a project they'd never see completed. But I don't think it was wasted, Marshal. I think she understood something a lot of people take a long time to learn, that some of the most important work you'll ever do is work you don't get to see the ending of. She built this so her granddaughter's children wouldn't have to be afraid the way her own generation was afraid. Today, they don't have to be. I'd call that worth it. I think she would too. Ilorinve did not respond immediately, and when she finally did, her voice carried something unmistakably close to genuine respect. Then I hope, Captain, that this is the last time your species has to answer that question with a warship instead of a handshake. So do I, Marshal, Okonkwo Faraday said. So do I. There was a brief pause on the line, filled with the particular static of 2 commanders neither quite ready to close a channel that had, however unexpectedly, become something more than purely adversarial over the course of 19 minutes. One further thing, Captain, Ilorinve said finally. The plaques you mentioned the names of those who built this vessel and never lived to see it used. I would consider it a genuine courtesy, not a bureau formality, if your command saw fit to share even a partial record of them. A species capable of that kind of patience deserves to have its history remembered accurately by the rest of us, whatever else this correction ends up meaning for either of our governments. Okonkwo Faraday considered that for a moment, surprised, and found that he meant his answer entirely. I'll pass that along, Marshal. I think they'd have liked that a great deal more than they'd have liked a parade. Most of them didn't build this thing for recognition. They built it so nobody would ever have to write a eulogy for the whole species again. If a little accurate history is the thanks they finally get for that, I think that's more than fair. The flagship folded into warp and was gone, and with it, the last visible trace of the Concord reclamation flotilla vanished from Sol system's sensors, leaving behind nothing but drifting debris from the earliest exchanges, a formal extinction correction already propagating through 211 member worlds worth of stunned bureaucratic channels, and one very patient, very quiet human warship holding its position exactly where it had first appeared. Its slow crimson pulse steady and unbothered, precisely as it had been from the very first second of the engagement. Okonkwo Faraday finally allowed himself to sit back down, letting out a long breath that carried in it 19 minutes of focused calm and 3 centuries of institutio. Now patience finally, fully spent. "Vasquez Okoro," he said, "get me that report finished. I want command to have the full picture before whatever passes for Galactic News Services get their own version running, because I promise you, ours is going to sound modest next to whatever they invent." "Already most of the way there, sir," she said, and allowed herself, at last, a wide, unguarded grin. "For what it's worth, I trained for this scenario more years than I want to admit, ran the simulations more times than I can count, and it still wasn't half as satisfying as watching it happen for real." "It never is," Okonkwo Faraday agreed, "until it actually happens." He allowed himself one last look out through the forward viewport at the empty, quiet stretch of space where 60 ships had briefly, arrogantly assumed an empty system was theirs for the taking, and found that the silence out there, the same silence 3 centuries of ancestors had built their entire strategy around, no longer felt like something to hide inside. It felt, for the first time in longer than his family's own history could properly account for, like something they'd finally earned the right to break on their own terms. Back in the war room 3 kilometers beneath the Colorado Rockies, General Adami Sahlberg watched the last of the 60 ships vanish from the tactical display, and finally allowed the tension she'd been carrying since the first alert klaxon to fully leave her shoulders. Around her, the celebration that had begun the moment the marshal's correction transmitted was still going, officers embracing, someone in the back of the room already opening a bottle of something that had clearly been saved for exactly this occasion for a very long time. Lieutenant Fenimore, still staring at the display, finally found his voice again. "Ma'am," he said, "what happens now, to the program I mean? Are there more ships, or was the Extant always meant to be the only one?" Adami Sahlberg considered the question, and considered, too, how much of the answer was still classified even in a room that had just watched 3 centuries of secrecy pay off in the most public way imaginable, weighing what a species owed its own newest officers against what it still, perhaps, owed a little longer to caution. "There are more, Lieutenant," she said finally. "But I hope, today was the last time we needed to send one out looking like a threat instead of an introduction. That's rather the point of everything we built, not to conquer, just to make sure nobody ever again thought conquering us was an option worth trying." She glanced back at the display, at the empty space where 60 ships had briefly, arrogantly, assumed an empty system was theirs for the taking. "Log the engagement, Lieutenant. Full record, unredacted, released to every diplomatic channel we have the moment the Bureau's correction goes public. I think it's time the rest of the galaxy heard the whole story, not just the ending." "Yes, ma'am," Fenimore said, already turning to his console and then almost to himself. "Extinct. They actually filed us as extinct." "They did," Adami Sahlberg said, and allowed herself, finally, a real, unguarded laugh, 300 years of quiet vindication wrapped up in the sound of it, the kind of laugh that had been waiting patiently behind decades of careful, disciplined restraint for exactly this moment to finally arrive. "And we filed a complaint. I'd say that's about as fair a response as a species could ask for. Somewhere out past the edge of the solar system, in 211 other member worlds scattered across a Concord that had spent 3 centuries treating an entire species as a closed case, word was already beginning to travel through diplomatic channels, through frightened crew testimonies, through a formal correction document that would, in the coming weeks, force the resignation of no fewer than 6 senior Bureau officials, and trigger the single largest emergency session the Concord Assembly had convened in over a century. That a species once filed away as extinct, once quietly subdivided into real estate lots and mailed out to the highest bidders, had woken from 300 years of deliberate, patient silence, and calmly, methodically, without spilling a single drop of blood on either side, filed the most thoroughly substantiated complaint in the Bureau's recorded history. And somewhere in that same message, traveling quietly alongside the disbelief and the frantic institutional damage control, was a simpler truth that would take the wider galaxy considerably longer to fully absorb, but which every single officer aboard 60 humbled Concord vessels now carried home with them regardless: that humanity had not merely survived being declared extinct. It had used the silence that declaration bought it to become something the galaxy had never once accounted for in its paperwork. And now, whether the Bureau liked it or not, the correction was permanent, the record was public, and everyone else had just found out exactly who they'd been filing under the wrong heading all along. In the weeks that followed, the story would travel faster and further than anyone aboard the Extant that day could have predicted. Passed first through the frightened, half-disbelieving accounts of 60 crews who had watched a species written off as a closed case demonstrate, calmly and without a single casualty, exactly how thoroughly that classification had failed to keep pace with reality, and then through the Concord's own increasingly desperate internal channels, as Bureau officials scrambled to determine who precisely had signed off on the original survey 3 centuries earlier, and whether that signature still carried a pension worth protecting. Diplomatic requests began arriving within days, tentative and carefully worded, from a handful of the Concord's 211 member worlds curious enough, or simply cautious enough, to want to understand exactly what kind of neighbor had just reappeared at the edge of their charted space. Adami Sahlberg fielded the first of them personally, and found, to her own quiet satisfaction, that she rather enjoyed the work of being believed for once, instead of merely tolerated as a footnote in someone else's registry. It was, she reflected more than once during those early, careful exchanges, a strange kind of luxury after 3 centuries of silence. The simple, ordinary experience of being asked a genuine question by someone who actually wanted to hear the honest answer, rather than a question designed to justify a decision that had already been made somewhere in a distant Bureau office long before the asking. And out at the edge of Sol's system, long after the last Concord running light had folded into warp and vanished, the Extant held its position a while longer still, its slow crimson pulse steady and patient, keeping the same quiet watch it had kept for 300 years before anyone outside a single buried war room had known it existed at all. Except that now, for the first time in all that silent, careful waiting, the watch it kept was no longer a secret. And the species it was built to protect no longer needed to wonder, in the dark, whether anyone would ever come looking to find out the truth. The truth had already been filed, signed, time-stamped, and delivered directly to the people who'd gotten it wrong. Extinction, it turned out, had a complaint department after all, and humanity had just become its first and most thoroughly documented exception on record. Nobody, on any of the 211 worlds now quietly revising their own archives, would be filing that particular paperwork again without checking twice.